Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth session of the Healthcare and Life Sciences track at TC18. Are you guys having fun yet? Awesome. So I'm Andy Day. I'm the Senior Director for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Tableau. My responsibilities include the industry strategy and marketing for providers, payers, pharma, and med devices globally. I'm one of the co-founders of the healthcare vertical at Tableau, and it is my honor to introduce our presenters today. But a little bit about McKesson. So I've worked previously at SAP and GE Healthcare, and McKesson has been a customer of mine from my days at SAP. And happily for us, they're one of our largest customers at Tableau. So a few things about McKesson that are really, really interesting. The first is they're one of the 3 largest distributors of pharmaceutical products in this country and perhaps in the world. They are number 7 on the list of the Fortune, number 6 on the list of Fortune 100 corporations, which is spectacular. And while I've previously thought of them, or one obviously thinks of them as a supply chain and distribution company, my learning as I've interacted with senior leadership is they think of themselves as a technology company that happens to be in the supply chain business. So with that as context, I'd like to introduce Casey Dominguez, who is the Director of Analytics, and Patrick Wellen, who is a Senior Architect, to talk about this journey around how they are standardizing spend analytics and providing that as valuable insights for the provider customers to help standardize their pharma spend and rationalize it to drive value. Casey and Patrick, please take it away.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks everyone. Thanks for staying towards the end of the day today to listen to our presentation. Patrick and I are really excited to be here to talk a little bit about how we're using Tableau to create a user-determined analytics experience, focusing specifically on pharmacy data. So today I'll go through a little bit of background, talk a little bit about why we decided to build this solution and how we're using it to meet our customers' needs. We'll talk about our approach to building both the architecture as well as the interface. I'll do a short live demo of our site for you. And then Patrick will come up here, talk about the technical challenges, as well as lessons learned. And then I'll finish it up with summary, future directions, and then we will take questions. So it's been widely reported in the media that healthcare costs are on the rise. I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not know this. They've been on the rise for the last 20 years. They have outpaced the growth of the US economy. And in the US, we now spend more per capita on healthcare expenditures than any other country in the world. Healthcare expenditures count for about 18% of our gross domestic product here in the US. Now, pharmaceuticals are only about 10 to 12% of that healthcare spend, but their growth is much higher than other segments of the healthcare industry. So if you take a look at my graph there on the right, the blue line is showing you the growth in total pharmaceutical expenditures. And you can see there was a big spike in about 2014, 2015. That's the most recent spike there. And this is mainly driven by growth in spending in our outpatient locations. So clinics, cancer centers, infusion centers. And that's represented on the red line there. In addition to that, new spending is driven by new drugs in the market. Those are usually more expensive than the drugs that have been around for a little while. And then higher prices on our existing brand name drugs. So those are our main drivers of pharmaceutical spending. Now, 2017, last year, was somewhat of an exception in this trend in that our spending on pharmaceuticals was lower than forecasted. So our spending only grew about 1.7% when it was expected to grow about 3 to 5%. But the trends remain the same. So growth is still coming from spending in our outpatient clinics. That's the red bar on the graph on the right there. And there was actually a decrease in spending in retail as well as non-federal hospitals, which we think of more as inpatient spending. Looking forward to 2018, the forecasted increase in pharmaceutical spend is about 3 to 5%, so moderate spending, but still above the growth in our economy. And again, that trend is the same. So most of that spending we'll expect to come from outpatient clinics. Now, I'm emphasizing the difference between growth in inpatient and outpatient spending because the reimbursement models are different in those 2 areas, and that's why looking at spend in those 2 locations is complex and has to be done somewhat separately. So in the inpatient space, drugs are generally reimbursed as a lump sum based on the diagnosis. So if you get admitted with a heart attack, The hospital is going to receive a lump sum from your insurance company for your treatment, regardless of the drugs that you get or the procedures that you get, or how long you stay in the hospital. It's one lump sum. Now, there's many factors that go into creating that lump sum, but generally that structure requires us as hospital pharmacists to try to reduce drug spend on the inpatient side. We try to use the lowest cost drug available that will give us the best outcome, optimize drug contracts, restrict drugs based on location, and use guidelines to optimize drug use. So whenever I say inpatient drug spend, you think reduce drug costs. Outpatient is a completely different story. Outpatient drugs are not reimbursed as a lump sum. In fact, they're reimbursed as a percentage above what we call the average sales price, which is across the country how much that drug is being sold for. So in the outpatient space, there really isn't a huge drive to reduce drug costs so much as there is a drive to make sure that the drugs we're administering are profitable. So what we're paying for the drug is less than how much we're getting reimbursed. To do that, we need to do several things. Ensure appropriate billing. This is probably the biggest in the area where people go wrong the most. Negotiate good payer contracts, make sure that the rates we're getting paid on cover our costs, and then potentially use a more profitable drug for a specific indication if we have multiple options. So historically, hospitals have really focused more on managing inpatient drug spend, and that's the one where we're trying to reduce costs, mainly because 15, 20 years ago, that's where most of the drug spend really was. It's also a little bit easier to manage that drug spend because it's pretty simple to just try to reduce costs as much as you can. However, all of these changes in trends and complexity in healthcare really requires us to develop a new approach to managing inpatient and outpatient drug spend separately. So stepping back for a minute, we do have a current customer-facing analytics product in the market. It is called Spend Analytics, and it is focused on the drug spend. So this solution is all about how much the drugs are being purchased for, and was mainly developed when we were in the realm of analyzing inpatient drug spend. This solution analyzes trends, it identifies opportunities to reduce costs, help people explain variances, and then track cost savings from different initiatives that the pharmacy department is working on. Towards the right there are just a few examples and screenshots from our current solution. This solution has been in the market about 9 years in some form or another and has been on the Tableau platform around 2 years. It has over 530-something facilities on it right now and about over 1,200 distinct users. This approach of analyzing drug spend can be very successful. This is an example from one of our customers out on the East Coast. They're a pretty large, complex health system. They have several hospitals. They have outpatient clinics, retail pharmacies, a specialty pharmacy. So kind of what you think of as your average health system today. And they were in a bind. They needed to reduce their inpatient drug spend, and they really needed a better way to analyze their spend. They were using Excel and merging files together and doing most of this manually. So they used our Spend Analytics product. They saved $2 million in 1 year due to just a few short formulary changes that they identified through the solution, and then saved over 500 labor hours that year as well from not having to manually manipulate all of this different data. So this approach of just analyzing drug spend can be very helpful. You can see that here in the example. However, in the current environment in healthcare, growing complexity, all of the changes that we're seeing, we really needed a different approach. So I've highlighted here the 3 main changes in healthcare that are requiring hospital pharmacies to really think of a different approach to analyzing their data. So the first and probably the most important is changes in reimbursement. So there's been several things that have changed for drug reimbursement. Just the beginning of this year, outpatient reimbursement for selected drugs under a program called 340B were reduced by 28%. So that's a huge reduction in reimbursement for these specific drugs that really required hospitals to further evaluate whether this program was working for them and what they needed to do to remain financially stable. Value-based payment models would drastically change the way in which we even approach outpatient drug reimbursement and change it from a percentage above the cost reimbursement to more based on outcomes. So that would significantly change reimbursement. And then there are many different proposals in the market right now, both at the state and federal level that would change reimbursement, things like site-neutral payments, et cetera. The second big change in healthcare, as I talked about earlier, is the move towards more outpatient care. So the trend in pharmaceutical spending is all in the outpatient space. We're talking about clinics, cancer centers, infusion centers. And this is largely seen as a positive move for both payers and for patients. Outpatient care is less expensive, which is great, and patients prefer it. They don't have to stay in the hospital for several days to get their chemotherapy. They can just come to the clinic back and forth for each of those 3 to 5 days. So this is generally seen as a good thing. It just increases complexity for the pharmacy because, as we talked about, those reimbursement models are different. So what you need to evaluate in each location is separate. And then third, market consolidation in healthcare has steadily increased since 2009. I'm sure you've heard about hospitals buying physician offices and cancer centers and infusion centers. Health systems are buying individual hospitals in their rural areas. And this is really driven by many factors. It's certainly driven by a financial factor, but also really driven by a move towards more value-based care and population health. It's easier for a health system to manage the health of their entire population if it all happens within their system. So each of these changes, good or bad, created specific challenges for our hospital pharmacies. So the changes in reimbursement really require the hospital to be able to quickly analyze the profitability of drugs. And quickly is really the key there. As things are changing with reimbursement, it's going down, we're changing to different models, they need to be able, almost in real time, to assess the profitability of what they're administering. 2, the move towards more outpatient care, as I mentioned, requires hospitals to have a separate approach to inpatient and outpatient drug usage. Inpatient drug usage, higher spend is bad. Outpatient, it depends. So it really requires a different approach. And then market consolidation requires hospitals to integrate data from many more sources. So if you think of that kind of average health system and they purchase a hospital even 5 miles away, that hospital may have a different electronic health record, they may have a different patient accounting system, billing system, and you need to integrate all of that data into what you're currently working with. So that also creates significant challenges. So based on those challenges, we developed this current product. It's a customer-facing analytics solution that is integrating data from purchase data to usage data to reimbursement data, all to help the hospital pharmacy reduce inpatient costs and then optimize outpatient drug profitability. So there's 3 main sources of data. So the purchase data, as a wholesaler, we generally have, although we do integrate some other pieces of purchase data. Usage data, as you, I'm sure, know, comes directly from the hospital, and this just tells us how the drugs are being used within the health system. So what diagnosis are they being used for, where are they being used, who's prescribing them, how much, and for how long. And then for our outpatient drugs, we are pulling in the reimbursement data as well. And this is actual reimbursement data, not a projection, so that we can see how much we're being reimbursed for those drugs, assess profitability, compare payers, and even compare prescribers. So now let's take a look at how we decided to approach building a solution like this. As I mentioned, several different data sources, and potentially, combining the data sources was actually the most difficult part of this entire project. Within each of those 3 sources, there are several other areas that we pull data from. So purchase data is the wholesaler data, but it's also data from any other vendor the hospital buys drugs from. And then we include other databases to help us normalize the drug data like First Data Bank. Usage data comes from both dispense or administration data, depending on the hospital. But we also need data from patient accounts, so we know when the patient was admitted, who the admitting physician was, what the diagnosis code was, what the location was. And then again, for those outpatient drugs, we are pulling in 835 files, which tells us how much the insurance company reimbursed the hospital for that drug. We pull those in from each individual payer. So if you can imagine how many payers or insurance companies your hospital works with, we're pulling it from all of those, and then we also match that up with patient accounting data. So we combine all this data, and then out of the data, what we hope to get is opportunities to reduce those inpatient drug costs, identify those outpatient drugs that have suboptimal reimbursement so we can take action, and then view prescriber variances so that we can affect behavior change if necessary. Now, combining the data is definitely one of the big challenges here, and this is a little bit of how we started to approach it. So in this architecture towards the bottom, those are all of our data sources. I've listed most of them that we talked about on the last slide. From there, we take the fields we need from each of those data sources, and we move them into what we call the data transformation layer. We first put them into staging tables, and then on those staging tables, we run several algorithms, as well as validate and correct the pharmacy data as necessary. I think in the last presentation, they were talking about pulling data out of Epic and how it's sometimes muddy and not exactly what they wanted, and they don't know if they have the right field. So this is our way to take care of that. We have an internal interface for our analysts where they can view all of the data, the raw data that we're getting from the customer, and they can write rules to adjust the data as necessary. And they can do that at the NDC and even the MRN level. So once we've validated the data, we've run all of our algorithms, we move the data from the staging tables to our data warehouse, which then eventually feeds our Tableau interface. Here's a little bit about how we decided to approach building our dashboards. So we built 3 main dashboards. We built them at a summary level first, and then we give the user a path to getting more detailed data. We realized that this is a large set of very complex data. So our main goal was to simplify that data as much as we could, give the user a very quick method for identifying those areas of opportunity. We wanted to call those out for the user as much as we could so they didn't have to go digging through all the data to find the areas that they should spend time on. And then, of course, we needed an intuitive interface so that we didn't have to spend a lot of time training all of these different users on how to use our dashboards. So as I mentioned, 3 summary-level dashboards. Across the tops of the dashboards, you'll see that we've created these tiles at the top. I was really excited to see that Charles Schwab had those in their keynote this morning, so it made me think that we were on the right path with those tiles. And that really helps to summarize the key points for the user as well. And then we give them a path to drilling down to more detailed data where the user gets to decide if they need to get to those details or if they're comfortable with the summary level data that we're presenting. All right, so now I'm going to switch over and show you a live demo. Okay, here we go. So this is our site here. Starting at the top, this is our existing product, our spend analytics solution, and all of the dashboards that we have. And then right next to it, this is our new solution, Utilization Analytics, that we're talking about here today. So on each of our dashboards, over on the left, you can see here's all of our filters. So the default will be to show all data, but this is what allows our users to customize what they're seeing in addition to drilling down to more detailed data. I mentioned our tiles across the top. This gives them a high-level overview, key points, and what they can expect to see in this dashboard. So this dashboard specifically is focusing on inpatient drug costs, and we're looking at it starting at the diagnosis level. Sometimes I refer to diagnosis as DRG, just means diagnosis-related grouping. So if I'm going back and forth between the two, I'm still talking about diagnosis. So here's all of our inpatient utilization costs, again, related just to drugs, and then whether they're going up or down. Here's our diagnosis that we're spending the most on per patient, highest cost diagnosis. And then this is the diagnosis that's increasing the most per patient. As I scroll down, our first graph here, this is going to show all of the diagnoses for this particular health system. The blue is going to show the current time frame, and then the orange is a comparison to the previous time frame. So this is our internal benchmarking option for the users. It allows them to see where they are right now, but also if things are increasing or decreasing over time. We added in a few extra options here on these graphs that lets the user look at this as a cost per patient basis, which would be the most common, but also a total cost. So sometimes we need to know, is this a high volume versus a high cost diagnosis? So am I seeing a lot of patients with it, and that's why I'm spending a lot of money? Or am I seeing few patients, but when I do, it's really expensive? And that's important because our approach to reducing costs is different based on those two scenarios. So these are all of our diagnoses here. Below that, we have our trends over time for those same diagnoses. We really included this because of outliers. So this really helps us quickly pinpoint, in this example here, if there is an outlier that's skewing our data. It can really help us explain why trends are going up or down. We've included length of stay as well. Now, length of stay is a tricky one because it is not perfectly correlated to drug costs, actually, when we're looking at admissions. Drug costs usually occur early in the admission and not so as much towards the end. but this still can be very important for looking at drug costs. In addition to that, we use this specific graph if we decide to use a drug, particularly a new drug that's higher cost and was recently approved, because they tell us that it's going to reduce length of stay. So your clinicians, I'm sure, have heard of these drugs and tried to use them. And it's really important to validate that in the real world. And so we can use this to look at those diagnoses to make sure that length of stay is, in fact, decreasing with the use of that higher cost drug. And then our last graph here highlights for us, again, whether these diagnoses are high cost versus high volume. The orange here is the percent of total cases that this diagnosis represents, and then the percent of total drug costs that this diagnosis represents. So this will be a summary level of this particular dashboard, but I think the real magic behind this is the ability to get more data. So if I take a look at my diagnosis here, acute myocardial infarction, I can drill down to get some more detail to find out which drugs specifically are driving costs for this diagnosis. So my first graph here will show me all the drugs being used for acute MI, which in other words is a heart attack. Again, blue is the current time frame, orange is the previous. So if I'm looking at this as the clinician right away, I can see, well, my use of heparin has really increased for acute MI, spending a lot more on heparin than I was previously, and I'm spending much less on edoxaban. So that could help me explain why costs for this diagnosis are going up or down. Below that, I have a patient utilization graph, and this tells me the percentage of patients with this diagnosis that received this drug. So in this case, about 25% of my patients with acute MI have received esomeprazole, which is Nexium. This can be really helpful, again, from determining whether a drug is a high volume drug for this diagnosis versus just high cost, but also very important for drug use guidelines that sometimes require that a specific percentage of our patients receive a drug, like all of our patients should receive aspirin for a heart attack, things like that. And then we can view length of therapy. So we can look at how long patients are on these drugs. So whenever we look at drug costs, it's not just about selecting the appropriate drug, it's also about the appropriate dose for the appropriate length of time. So this helps us evaluate whether our patients are on the drugs for the appropriate length of time. And then the last two graphs here allow us to compare prescribers for this specific diagnosis. So prescriber comparison is a really important way to determine variances in our spending and also help us identify potential best practices. And these graphs can be used by the health system to focus their attention on who they need to talk to or who they need to educate on this specific drug or this specific diagnosis. So we can see Dr. Bird is our high-cost prescriber for acute MI, spending $4,200 a patient. Dr. Castaneda is only spending about $600 per patient for acute MI. So that's a pretty wide difference. We'd certainly want to investigate what's causing that and see where we can identify some best practices. And then we've added the length of stay by prescriber to help inform that decision. And then our third level, we can drill down to once we click on the drug and see a prescriber variance for a specific drug for a specific diagnosis. So we're kind of getting into the weeds here, but that's why it was important to develop a summary level first so that we don't show all of this data right away and people get lost, but they can still get down to this level of detail if they need to. Our next dashboard is utilization by drug. This dashboard will include both inpatient and outpatient usage. It will provide some diagnosis information, but we're not going to start there. We're just going to start with the drug level. So this would help a clinician if they had interest in one specific drug. Maybe they realize they're spending a ton of money on a new drug, and they want to figure out how and where it's being used within the health system. This is a very simple way to do it. So again, at the top, our tiles will give us a summary level of both inpatient and outpatient usage of drugs, utilization costs, and whether those are going up or down. So in this case, I can see I'm spending about 3 times as much on drugs inpatient than I am in the outpatient setting. Next, we have all of our drugs listed here. The length of the bar will show total utilization costs. This is how much I'm spending on these drugs in total. And then the different colors in this case are breaking it out by my different locations. So I can see if those are being used mostly inpatient or outpatient, if I have multiple campuses, which campus is using a drug, again, to help the user really focus their attention on who they need to talk to get the biggest bang for their buck. As I move down, I can now compare those locations for each of these drugs on average cost per day. So if I'm looking at edoxaban, which is the drug we were looking at on the last dashboard, I can see that in my Emerald City clinic, my outpatient clinic, I'm spending about $1,500 per day on edoxaban. But at the Gotham University Hospital, we are spending about $2,500 per day on edoxaban. So those are different care centers, and maybe that's appropriate, but it does give us an opportunity to view that variance, focus our attention, and potentially come up with best practices there. If you haven't guessed already, we are using demo data in this example. The developers are having a little fun coming up with the names. That is thanks to Patrick here. And then the last thing I have on this first level of the dashboard here is our price change table. And this is an interesting table because this pulls in yet another field that I didn't have on my slide, which is our entire McKesson price catalog, so that we can forecast for customers price changes and what the impact on their budget would be. As you can imagine, we're showing every NDC on each of their accounts, so this table can become extremely big. So we developed some thresholds on our left filter bar here that allow us to bring this table down to what actually makes an impact for us. So for example, perhaps we don't really care about price increases that are going to affect our budget by $20, but we certainly care if it's going to affect our budget by $1,000. So by using our thresholds, we can filter our table. Now we have just about 10 or 12 lines that we really need to investigate and take a look at and potentially make changes for. From here, we can drill down as well. So we have drill downs for each of our 3 dashboards. So the top level, we're kind of at the drug level at a summary. As we drill down, we can now break out the usage of this specific drug. This is the pneumococcal vaccine by service line. So we see that most of our pneumococcal vaccine is being used by our internal medicine service. So if we wanted to switch products, if we wanted to reduce costs or increase usage, either of those, we would know we should go to our internal medicine team first. That's where most of the usage is, and we'll get most of our impact. And then we also provide that information at the prescriber level as well. And so here are all the prescribers that have used pneumococcal vaccine in our health system, and the different colors are going to show us the different diagnoses that's being given for. So you can see the 2 purple colors here. So most of our pneumococcal vaccine, by looking at this, is being given for bronchitis or asthma or COPD. So again, if we want to make an impact, now we have prescribers we can focus on or diagnoses that we can focus on. And then I'll finish up the demo with our last dashboard. This is our reimbursement dashboard. This is going to focus only on outpatient drug usage, but this is the dashboard where we'll pull in all of that reimbursement information so that we can look at profitability. Again, tiles toward the top that'll show us our profit and our margin for all of these drugs that are included. First graph here is going to break out that profit by location. So if it's green up here towards the top, that means the location is profitable. They're making money on these drugs. And if it's in red, that means they're losing money. So again, if I was the director of pharmacy or the clinician responsible for these locations, this is where I would be focusing my attention on who is losing the most money. And then we can also look at the distribution of reimbursement by payer. So I can quickly see that Medicare and Medicaid are my 2 biggest payers. So if I need to renegotiate contracts or look into an issue, I'm going to go to those 2 first because they're accounting for most of my reimbursement. Just a little aside, we did include some payer filters over here, so we can take a look at profit and margin specific to a payer as well. So we don't have to look at it in the aggregate. We can get some more detailed information and look at that by payer. Okay, so let me go back to all. So as I scroll down, we can now look at profitability by drug. So we've looked at it by location, so sort of at a high level. Now we're getting down to the drug level. So this would help us focus on which drugs we need to target to see which ones we're losing money and which ones we're making money on. The blue portion of this bar shows total utilization costs. So it's how much we're spending to administer these drugs. The green is going to show us if we're profitable. So these ones, we're all good. We're making money on these. As I go all the way towards the bottom, I can now see the ones I'm losing money on, and it's over here in the red. So again, if I'm responsible for these clinics, this is exactly where I'm focusing my attention. What are these drugs? Why am I losing money? And how can I change that? And then as I scroll down, we can also view profitability by prescriber. So these are all of our prescribers in this outpatient space. Again, green would be profitable prescribers. Red would be those that are losing money. We can drill down here. So if we click on one of our prescribers, we can see even the exact drugs that they are prescribing in this outpatient space and which ones they're losing money on and which ones they're making money on. So if I were to drill into this specific prescriber and take a look at their drugs and see that they're losing money on every single drug, it would be pretty obvious to me that this is a billing issue. They're clearly doing something wrong in the billing system and they're not getting reimbursed for anything that they're administering. But again, it helps us focus our attention. Which prescribers do we need to go to? Which drugs do we need to go to fix the problem? So that is our short demo for today. I'm going to switch back over, and then I'll turn it over to Patrick to talk a little bit about the technical challenges that we encountered while we were building this and some of the lessons learned.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not used to hearing my voice through the microphone. I'm like, does this sound as bad to you as it does to me?
Sounds great.
We learned some lessons around, development efficiencies, trying to get the performance where we needed to be, how to use the JavaScript API, and we ran into a problem with dynamic color changes that is still yet to be solved. So if anyone's got a solution, come talk to me after. Initially, when we were just, pie in the sky proof of concept thing, I developed a solution that was just all in one workbook with multiple dashboards and all these worksheets and navigating between the different ones with user actions. And I think I ended up with something on the order of like 40 worksheets or something like that. And even with my very small data set I was using for that proof of concept, I noticed a drop in performance from just the sheer number of sheets, not to mention just scrolling along the bottom trying to find which sheet is the one I need to work on at any given moment. And so once we said like, oh, this, even your problematic proof of concept, we want to move forward, it was like, well, how are we going to divide the work up? If it's all just this one workbook and only one developer can work on it, how is a larger team going to work on this? So how are we going to divide the work between multiple developers? And then, as I said, it was on the order of 40 sheets. So like, hey, new person, figure out what I did. It'll be great. So how are we going to reduce that complexity so that a new developer can come in and look at it and say, okay, I get roughly what you're doing here. And then also, especially when you have something that complex, Tableau, you can have unintended consequences. You're looking at something, you didn't realize you clicked it, but you clicked it, and now everything else has changed because it's all in the same workbook, it's all affecting everything else. So that led us to the conclusion of like, okay, what we're going to do is split these levels up. So level 1 is going to be one workbook, its own thing. Level 2 is going to be a completely separate workbook. Level 3, completely separate workbook. So I can work on level 1 while a different developer works on level 2. And then that also, each one is simpler because it only has to worry about its level stuff. And the unintended consequences are less likely because you just have fewer things moving. And performance is going to be better because you get your sheets down and your complexity is less. So as I said, the worksheet count goes down. And so, I'm sorry, the order here, how am I going to explain this? So we know that when we pause the auto-updating, that can help a lot with performance. With all the filters you saw during our demo, some users don't realize that they can pause, and so they like change, wait. And it's like, well, if you just paused and made all your changes to exactly what you want and then ran it, you would avoid all that waiting, but some users don't necessarily see that. But so we've seen the value of auto-updating and minimizing how often Tableau goes and recalculates everything if the user isn't actually going to look at the intermediate result. They really would just want to see the final result. So what we ended up doing is stacking the levels on the same page. So when the user first comes in, they're going to see the top level, as you saw during the demo. What they don't realize is underneath it, there are 2 other Tableau instances that are also existing at the same time. But their auto-updates have been paused. And so when the user clicks on the first one, we tell the next layer, hey, they clicked on this drug or this diagnosis, whatever the drill down effect is. We tell the next one, And then we just use Z order to flip that to the top, and the one that was on top is now beneath it. So by keeping the communication between them synced, we can, from the user's perspective, make it look like they're navigating all within the same workbook when in fact they're completely different Tableau instances. I'm sorry. So we use the JavaScript API to do that, and then also when the user clicks on a filter, we just send those messages down. And then the ones that are not visible, they're auto-pause so that the user can do a bunch of filter changes on the top one, and we're not using up resources to recalculate everything on the other sheets. Only the one that gets flipped to the top. When it gets flipped to the top, we also unpause the auto updates. It recalculates everything, and it shows them appropriately. Side benefit of that, if they haven't actually made any changes, but they just want to leap between the levels, like, oh, I've drilled all the way down here, I want to go back to the top, that actually is just a flip. And it's instantaneous because they aren't changing anything. Tableau already figured that out for them, so it's just flipping them to the top. They don't realize that, that we didn't have to do any work for that. And the color change limitation was a fun one. So as you saw, we had like, oh, here are the drugs that you're spending the most on. And we figure out colors for those top 10 drugs, and it's all great. But then the user can go and play with those filters on the left and be like, no, I just want to look at this one facility with these NDCs or these, whatever. And they can figure out a way to get things in those top 10 that when Tableau assigned colors, it assigned those colors to the same thing. So you get the same color for 2 different drugs or diagnoses or what have you. And because it doesn't dynamically change, it determined it at development time, we don't know what they're going to do with those filters. So I haven't been able to figure out a way to prevent the possibility of having the same color show up twice, which kind of ruins the whole effect of like everyone's a different color to show, distinguish them from each other. So that's pretty much it for my technical side of things.
Awesome, thanks, Patrick. I'm sure there'll be questions at the end, so don't go anywhere, because I can't answer those. So as Patrick told you, there were definitely some challenges to developing this type of solution, but when we look at the benefit, it was certainly worth it both to us and to our hospital pharmacies. So if we kind of think of an average size health system, I work with health systems kind of across the spectrum from a tiny hospital that spends $1 million on drugs to a 50 hospital system that spends $400 million on drugs a year. So that's the spectrum, but an average facility would be somewhere in the middle, maybe spending $50 million a year on drugs. They have a few hospitals, several outpatient locations, a few retail pharmacies, so something like that. If we think of that $50 million hospital, we project we could bring them an additional $250,000 per year based on this type of solution. And that comes from about a 0.5 to 1% increase in additional outpatient revenue based on their outpatient drug spend, and then a 0.5 to 1% decrease in inpatient drug costs. So $250,000 a year, if you put that into perspective, that could be 2 more pharmacists for a hospital, that could be 4 to 5 more nurses for a hospital. So these are significant dollars that could be used to improve the quality of care. And then at the same time, the solution should reduce the time that the pharmacy staff needs to spend pulling reports, manually exporting things to Excel, and trying to merge databases. So that's an additional benefit as well. Where we are right now is finishing up development. So I got to get Patrick back to the office to finish up for the rest of the week. And then we'll be moving into our pilot and beta testing phase very soon. And then launching the solution probably in Q2 of 2019. Looking forward, as you can imagine, several other features on the list for us. External benchmarking is always a really important one. Everybody wants to know what other hospitals and other health systems are doing in the country. So we'll be working on that next. And things like drug accountability and opioid stewardship are also on the list and very important. But all of this, including our current solution, was based on lots of customer interviews and customer input. So in summary, as we've talked about, the healthcare field is constantly changing. There will continue to be pressure to reduce costs, and this really requires our hospital pharmacies to have a data solution that can analyze complex data sets. This is not simple data, it's very complex, and they need a solution that is flexible to the changing environment and can show them simplified data. So I think it's a really exciting time to be in healthcare analytics. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll take questions at this time.
Awesome. Huge round of applause for Casey and Patrick. Again, a pretty unique presentation in a novel area, and again, a compelling demo, including some of the how-tos, so that's awesome. So we have time for a few questions, so I'll come around and take those.
Excellent presentation. Thanks for this one.
Thank you.
I have seen one little icon on top of all of the charts, right-hand top side.
Oh, those are icons to let us export the data to Excel. And then the other one lets us view that particular chart or table on the whole page and then export it as a PDF or image.
So I believe that's extension API which you are using?
No. Those are just buttons that we're overlaying on top of the Tableau instance, and so that when it gets hit, we use the JavaScript API to trigger a change. Whether that's, in some cases, if we needed the data to look nicer, we would create a separate sheet for how we wanted it to look in Excel. Other times, we were just able to say, yeah, throw it to Excel, and it was good enough. So it just depended.
Thank you.
I think some over here.
Hi, yeah, really impressive. I appreciate you. Yeah, you're right, it does sound weird to the speakers. So I'm really interested in your breaks between workbooks because, yeah, 40 sheets, we have some with hundreds, and it really slows down, and it's miserable. Miserable to work in. So it looked to me like maybe you had separate, like the same data sources for the same type of worksheets, except you made breaks after they hit like 5 or 6 charts going down, and then you had a new one on each page. They were embedded into that website, something like that?
Right, it was a Tableau instance for each level.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're just telling the next instance, hey, here's, they changed which facilities they're looking at. So you just tell that next one, and then the big thing is when they click. At that point, you say, hey, your filter is this diagnosis or this drug. And then on that worksheet, actually, when you're working with it, you have to remove that because normally it shows you nothing because it's like, well, you haven't told me the one filter I care about. So you have to kind of remember to always remove that when you deploy it, or else you're going to create problems for people. So the next sheet is kind of an isolation of I don't need to know what the upper level is doing as long as it just tells me the one diagnosis and its filters. So people can look at stuff on the top and the second level doesn't need to know about it. But they're connecting to the same underlying data source, if that's your question. I'm sorry if I didn't answer it.
Oh, no, yeah. And then it looked like that was just your own custom website that you just made new pages for and embedded the workbooks into?
Yeah, it's a website, and we have certain areas that management pages to let them alter the data for certain things that they can set up for their facility. We have a thing called metrics where they're like, oh, we want to measure this by this, and so we want to enter all this data. So it's just a collection of all that, and we wanted to make one seamless experience for them, so it's just all integrated into the web page.
Gotcha. Last question. Somebody who knows nothing about JavaScript APIs, what would it look like to get started and learn more? Because that looks pretty awesome.
I mean, if you're familiar with Java, it's not that bad, but it's definitely finicky. It's the kind of thing where oh, you capitalized that letter, so no, I don't agree. And I will not give you a good error message about why I don't agree. I'm just going to blow up at you, and you have to figure it out. Good luck. so it's tough, but as you work with it, you definitely get better and start seeing what's likely culprits and stuff. So it's a little challenging though. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Fantastic work.
No problem.
Hi. I have a question of how you, well, 2 questions really. First, how did you convince customers to give you their data? I think that'd be pretty difficult.
Very good question. So a few things. Number one, we have 2 other solutions that do different things in the market right now that work off this type of data. So many customers are already giving us data. We have a patient assistance program and a revenue cycle management program. And so they're already giving us that data. So I think they felt comfortable there. But certainly as we go through the process with customers, there's a huge security review that we have to do because they are sending us PHI. So developing that trusting relationship with them, all of that goes into the contract. We have to get a BAA before we can exchange data. It is absolutely necessary. But I think the reason that they are willing to give us their data is because it is very difficult to combine these three types of data on their own. And so across the board, from the small hospitals to the large hospitals, are just having difficulty making sense and combining this data. And so I think that outweighs the risks they see with exchanging data.
With how complex is of a solution you guys are providing, are you guys charging your customers for the solution?
Yes.
I don't want to. Well, not spending all.
Question back here.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Quick question, this stuff is very complicated, and I was curious if you had considered outsourcing to a third-party vendor, if that was weighed against building it internally so that you could support it, and if you did go through that process, what kind of led you to the decision to build it internally?
Good question. So when we built the prior product, Spend Analytics, we moved it over to Tableau about 2 years ago. We did use some contractors to help us with that work while our internal development team got up to speed on Tableau. But we have a really, really fantastic internal team that does a really great job. And so I didn't really see the need to outsource it. And then, as they build the product, they know it. So maintaining it in the long run seemed like it would be easier.
And to be brutally honest, they didn't deliver a working product. So.
Our last contractor, we did have some problems.
So can I add to that? And
Please.
Educated speculation. In this case, again, the insights you provide is actually a differentiator, and again, positions McKesson as a value-added trusted advisor versus a vendor.
Correct.
Hopefully that's a strategic.
Absolutely.
thing. Yeah.
Thank
okay.
you.
Hi, I have two questions for you. The first is this new Tableau dashboarding, are you able to do any customization to specific clients or customers?
So not in this first release. So we've sort of built this the way it is right now, and we'll push it out, and then that will be something that we'll likely work on in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've used the McKesson Spend Analytics before.
yeah.
And so I think I know for me personally, that was one of the limitations, is the way that we like to look
Yeah.
at the data isn't always in, just a care site grouping or things like that.
Sure.
And then when you determine average cost per drug, things like that, what are you guys just averaging wholesale and 340B and GPO, or what are you guys using to determine those costs?
Yes. This is part of what makes it complicated. So we have a specific algorithm that helps us determine where the drug was likely purchased. So if you're not familiar with the way drugs are purchased, they can be purchased on several different accounts for a hospital, and that doesn't always tell you where the drug is going to be used, actually. So we have GPO accounts, which are usually for inpatient, and then if you're a 340B hospital, we have 340B and WAC accounts that are generally used outpatient, but again, it's not perfect. So we use the location of where the drug was administered. We go back in your purchase data. For the month that you administered the drug, we go back to that purchase data to find out what you purchased it for. If it's inpatient, we use GPO. If you bought it from a different vendor, then we'll go back subsequently to the different vendors to find out how much you bought it for. If it's outpatient, we use a quantity averaged price between WAC and 340B for that specific month that you administered the drug, and that's how we go back and get it. So it's a little bit complicated. But we think that's probably the most accurate way we could do it for now.
Sounds good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Great
sure.
presentation.
Any other questions? Okay.
This is a brief question. Just a clarifying question regarding the price increases. Is the intent of that to help them understand their performance to their budget, or for future planning purposes?
So they could be used for both. Right now, I would expect it to be mostly used to look at their budget, like for the remaining fiscal year. We've put it on that page because people are using that page to potentially make formulary decisions, and we want them to be aware as they make formulary decisions of price changes so they can see what that impact would potentially be if they switch from one to another.
I've got a question here. Thanks. Great presentation. Question regarding data security. If you can touch on a little bit more. You mentioned PHI data coming in the building. Curious if there's a version that would be kind of an aggregated summary for folks that didn't have PHI access. And then also, are you handling row-level security within Tableau, or is it more of a data layer solution? Thank you.
Good question. So for this solution, the way it is right now, we are not showing PHI in the interface. So we initially intended to, and because of a lot of the things that you're asking about, it gets very complicated. And so we are not showing the patient level detail yet. Exactly, future phase. I think what we will likely have to do from talking with our security folks is we will be able to show, when they click on the dashboard, we will be able to show partial MRNs, and the rest of it will be grayed out. And then only if they need to actually look at that patient's data, they will have to click on it, and then they can see everything. That's important for us to prevent people who don't need to see that patient's data from looking at it, number one. And then number two, the auditing purposes. We have to know every person that looked at that data. And so that would help us with that as well.
Row-level security is at the data layer or within Tableau filters?
I mean, at this point, we're not pulling in the PHI into Tableau. Yep. So we've just left it off at that level. So we're just relying on the database security for the PHI right now. Once we get it in, then we'll have to talk about okay, let's make sure, how are we going to make sure that that there's no way that a hacker could get in and capture that PHI that's being sent to Tableau.
Hi, great presentation. I like the dashboards. They're very simple, easy to interpret. Few questions here, so I'm just going to kind of rapid fire throw them out. From the data integration piece, how are you ingesting those files? Are you using HL7 or anything like that? And then how often are you ingesting across the various data sources? Is it once a month, once a week?
Yep. So we do use some HL7 and then weekly data files from the customer, daily purchase files, since we're the wholesaler. We get those from our SAP database daily.
And then have you guys ran into any issues with just accuracy across those data sources for time series analysis, or are you doing mostly analysis on a single data source at a time? Or does that ever change, where if I'm looking at it today and I get more accurate data from that specific date tomorrow? Oh,
so we do have that. Sometimes price fluctuations, but more so on reimbursement because those claims take time to come in. So today it might say we got $10 and then we rebill it and then we get $5 more. So we have to add all of those different 835s together. So we do have that issue mainly with reimbursement data. Because of the way in which the drugs are reimbursed outpatient, we have a little delay set on that dashboard anyway, so we're not going to show the data for probably 6 weeks after the administration so that we make sure that we capture all of it. But it does get updated as we get new 835 files. Regarding accuracy of data, I would say the dispense and administration data is the area that we have the most problems with accuracy. And it seems like it's mainly pulling the right fields out of Epic and Cerner and this sort of thing. And that's why we built that sort of central layer in the architecture so that we could visualize the differences and then write rules to adjust it if we needed to. And those rules can be applied retrospectively, forward. They can be applied just for a specific time. So if the data from the hospital is only wrong on these 2 months, then we just apply it for those 2 months and use the rest of the data.
That makes perfect sense. And then I just have one last question. For these dashboards in this solution, who's kind of your main primary user type or persona? I'm guessing a lot of providers probably aren't logging into this.
Yeah, so we have a few personas. They're mostly all in the pharmacy department. This is really geared towards the pharmacy department. So from a management level, usually directors or assistant directors of pharmacy, sort of depending on what the structure is. Clinical pharmacists who are really focused on usually a specific disease state and trying to improve outcomes and usage of drugs will be working on that as well. In our current solution, we also have a lot of pharmacy buyers that use the purchasing portion to help assess drug spend. So those are our main personas.
Thanks.
Sure.
Probably have time for one more question. Okay, we'll take Elvira here.
So you talked about how the reimbursement rates differ in outpatient settings. And so given that different payers and within even a specific payer because of the different type of population you might be treating, how do you adjust for that in the data? for example, if you're looking at a particular prescriber, do you take into any adjustment line of business or a patient panel? Perhaps a prescriber has more Medicare or Medicaid population. How do you take into consideration those nuances?
Yeah, so that's why we have that filter bar on the left-hand side, so that we can filter to a specific payer and then compare prescribers just for that payer versus comparing them kind of with all of the payers combined in case there is a difference in the mix. So that's how we would do that, just use the filters on the left-hand side.
Yeah. So if they were investigating a specific prescriber, like why is this person spending so much, you could be like, well, let's start looking at the filters and say like, well, you know, how much of their stuff is Medicare, and then it's like, oh, well, that's basically all the money that they're prescribed is Medicare. Now I know their population is primarily that. And so it doesn't, you know, just immediately answer the question necessarily, but it gives the analyst the tools to dig in and look at, well, what about this, what about that, and hopefully be able to figure out the answer without having to, you know, go through too many like phone calls or emails or, you know, that sort of data gathering can be time consuming.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for questions. Huge round of applause for Casey and Patrick for a fantastic presentation.